Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hi, good people. Welcome back to A Fork in Time. This is Chris Coppola, and I am joined today by my friend Evan. You want to introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, how's it going? It's your boy Evan.
And today we're going to talk about geography.
Everybody's favorite subject.
Yes. You're listening to a history podcast about geography. Who suggested this? This was a friend of yours?
Yeah, this is a personal friend of mine that I actually know in real life, but his Discord handle is Sino
You
Kaiju.
have a life outside of the podcast?
What? How could this be? What sort of witchery and sorcery is this? I somehow managed to find time to live a life outside the podcast. And I will send him the A Fork in Time Discord link again. I think I sent it to him before, but he never joined the Discord server. So I'll have him try to join again so that we can interact with him and he can give us some more of his cool ideas. But he's been a longtime listener of the podcast and sometimes gives me a suggestion here and there. And he was the one who actually suggested the fork that we're going to be looking at today. And as Chris alluded to, we're going to be talking a little bit about geography, more like a lot bit about geography in this episode. So do bear with us. It may be helpful for you to pull up Google Maps or something, just to kind of keep a rough outline of some of the areas that we're talking about. But really, if you are from the Midwest, you are probably fairly well familiar with the areas that we are going to be discussing. But the fork in time that we're going to be discussing today, the events that happened in our own history, deals with a interesting little conflict known as the Toledo War. And the year is 1835. The place is a disputed area between the U.S. states of Michigan and Ohio, known as the Toledo Strip. Now, at this point in time, Ohio has been admitted as a U.S. state, but Michigan, actually, at this point, is not a U.S. state quite yet. It is still known as a U.S. territory. And back when, we have the Northwest Ordinance in 1787 with the Confederation Congress. This is before the Constitution was founded or written. They established the Northwest Territory, and they said, we're going to have a certain number of states that'll be split up from the Northwest Ordinance. And they have different boundaries between the different territories that they talked about. And one of the territories was essentially saying, all right, we're going to have a split on the southern end of Lake Michigan. The problem is that nobody knew where the southern tip of Lake Michigan was at that point. So as the surveyors and geographers got down to business and started figuring out where the end of this lake actually was, Ohio's claims kept changing. And this was somewhat of a problem, especially when we have the territory of Michigan trying to be admitted to the Union. The state of Ohio in 1802 put forth in their own constitution their own idea of where the border should be intersecting. And, don't want to get overly, into the weeds or into the details on that. But Ohio basically said, hey, we think that the northern boundary of our state should be north of the mouth of the Maumee River and possibly even of the Detroit River. And of course, that didn't end up happening as we kept finding out that Lake Michigan kept extending further and further south. So Ohio realized, go ahead.
Basically, as I understand it, if they did not, if it was actually the southern border of Lake Michigan, there's a real chance that Cleveland is in Michigan.
Yes,
that Ohio,
exactly.
that this line will intersect with kind of like the Erie area of Pennsylvania,
Yes.
which is already defined in everything. So Ohio might be completely like landlocked.
Landlocked. Yeah. Ohio stood to lose a lot from this, possibly.
I
And
mean,
so,
Cleveland.
hey, I mean, for any of our listeners who might be in Cleveland, well, let me just get this out here right now. I think this fork is going to ruffle a lot of Midwestern feathers.
It's going to ruffle a lot of feathers because
Yeah. So just buckle up, Buttercup, and get ready for that. Because I think, especially based on what we pre-gamed for the podcast, we're going to have a lot of fun with this one. But basically, Ohio loses nothing of value. I mean, they lose the wonderful, great city of Cleveland. And so to address this problem, the Ohio legislature basically included a provision in the 1802 Constitution that angled their boundary line slightly northeast to intersect Lake Erie at, again, the north of the Miami-Maumee Bay. When Michigan applied to be part of the Union, actually, well, going back to the Michigan Territory being created in 1805, Congress didn't actually bother to correctly define the territory's southern boundary. They basically just did a Control-V, a copy-paste from the Northwest Ordinances language, which
basically Ohio said, we control the Maumee Bay. We control what is today Toledo. The United States Congress never said yes to that.
Yeah, they never actually agreed. And so they Control-V'd what the 1787, what that Northwest Ordinance said, and didn't even bother to fact check themselves. And so as a result, we had this inconsistency between the Michigan state or the Michigan legislature and their territory charter versus what Ohio said. And that's what directly led to, in our timeline, the conflict known as the Toledo War, which really wasn't actually a war. It was basically just a bunch of troops, state militias on Michigan and Ohio's parts, and one sheriff, I think, from Ohio or from Michigan got stabbed.
Literally the casualty. One sheriff from Michigan got stabbed. What was the name of I love this. The name of the person that stabbed him?
I think he was, if I'm looking at the Wikipedia right now, I think it's 2 Stickney.
That is correct. It is 2, spelled like the number.
Like the number 2.
2 Shipney.
I think that's as amazing a name as we'll get in many, many episodes of this show. So the fork that my friend Sino Kaiju had proposed, Sino Kaiju on Discord, he basically said, what if in this conflict, so, and actually before I get into his fork and setting you up, let's finish out right to up to where this conflict was going. So the Toledo Strip, Michigan and Ohio are starting to mass militias, getting ready to, possibly go to war over this. And the president at the time is Andrew Jackson. And if you know anything about Andrew Jackson, you know that he doesn't really appreciate when states...
Anybody else's opinion?
Yeah, well, let's just go there. Anybody else's opinion but his own. He basically tells the Supreme Court to go screw themselves.
And the state of South Carolina.
And the state of South
and
Carolina. His own vice president.
Yes,
exactly. And so this is the kind of guy that you are dealing with, old Rough and Ready, Old Hickory. Actually, Old Rough and Ready was a different general, I think. Yeah. Right? Yeah. But Old Hickory, you're dealing with Old Hickory, who is not going to bend and yield. Ohio is a state, much more well-established, better economy, much more people. Michigan almost bankrupts themselves to be able to get their own militia started.
And basically, Ohio's kind of taking a step back on this. It's Michigan that's forming a militia that's actually aggressively doing these things.
Yes, precisely. And so with, the conflict brewing, a sheriff gets stabbed. We now have the very real possibility of Michigan going to war over the Toledo Strip with Andrew Jackson, who has a nice portrait of himself on our $20 bills now, sitting as president. So I think that sets up the fork pretty decently for what my friend suggested, which he said, I think it would be a cool fork in time if you explored what happened if Michigan hadn't accepted the federal government's terms and waged full-on war against Ohio. What those said terms are is Andrew Jackson looked at the situation, sent a
Well,
couple of his
first,
guys. Oh, go ahead.
Michigan said, we control this strip. That will be part of the state of Michigan. Then Andrew Jackson comes in and does this counteroffer.
Yeah. So Andrew Jackson sends some of his guys in, and then he comes up with a counteroffer. He says, okay, Michigan, we'll let you play nice. We'll play nice with you. We'll let you go away if you cede the Toledo Strip to Ohio and instead take the Upper Peninsula, now what we call the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, as part of your state. And at this time, Michigan did have like the very easternmost tip of the Upper Peninsula, but the rest of the Upper Peninsula was, as far as I know, not organized territory at this point, not really part of any sort of territory or state. Might have been part of Wisconsin.
It was probably part of the Northwest Territory that may not have even been called Wisconsin yet.
Yeah, exactly. Like we're talking about like pre, any real sense of organization there. So in our timeline, Michigan accepts the counter proposal and they cede the Toledo Strip. Toledo is now known as a city in Ohio, and they take the Upper Peninsula, which at the time was not seen as very valuable land. Even though it's much more land, it was just seen as a bunch of logging and a bunch of fur trapping sort of area. Of course, we now know that it had a bunch of iron deposits as well, but that was not known at the time.
The reason also that the Toledo area is so important is it is the mouth of a river.
Yep.
If you control
the waterways,
especially on the Great Lakes, if you are inland, you're shipping your stuff to there, and it needs to be taken off of a riverboat and put on basically an ocean-going vessel, because that's kind of what operates on the Great Lakes. So if you control that transshipment point, that's economically very, very valuable.
It's massive. Yeah, absolutely massive. There's a big reason why Michigan was wanting this, especially given that they're a territory that did not have, at this point, especially compared to Ohio, a lot going for them. Michigan was kind of like they viewed themselves as the David versus the Goliath in this story. They're like, hey, Ohio already has a ton of things going for them. They already got this. Just give us this little Toledo Strip, please. Like that was basically what Michigan's plea was. So in our timeline, they accept the offer. In our fork in time today, we are going to be seeing the results of what if Michigan had rejected the proposal and instead decided to take over the Toledo Strip. Chris, how about you take it from here? What do you think would be the primary immediate ramifications of such a move on Michigan's part?
So first and foremost, I kind of threw this out there. Michigan is going to be able to take over Toledo. This is kind of their big point. They are immediately able to do it because Ohio's kind of trying to play nice. They're already a state. They feel like that's already ours. So in the initial, start of this, Michigan's going to be able to take over the Strip. That's going to last about as long as it's going to take a horse rider to reach Washington and reach Andrew Jackson.
Yep.
He is not, just to kind of talk about something we alluded to, most of Americans will remember the nullification crisis, which was around this time, where basically he threatened to take over the port of Charleston to collect taxes when South Carolina said, we don't agree with it, so we don't have to. He was very much a fan of, it's a little hard to say central power. He's kind of like, reminds me a little bit of Thomas Jefferson, who was, so anti-central government until he is the central government.
Yep.
And once he is the central government, he's very much in favor of it. He, told the Supreme Court when they overruled his Indian Removal Act they can go ahead and enforce it themselves. He went ahead and cleared them out on his own against a judicial review. In this case, if he is faced with a United States state, a U.S. state being attacked, he is not going to take kindly to that. He
not
is
at all.
Probably, we've run across a couple of different items recently where people in the Discord have been talking about how prescient we are. We thank you for that. We're not. We're just lucky. But
my grandfather would always say, I'd rather be lucky than smart.
Yeah. In this case, though, Jackson is going to nationalize the Ohio Guard. He is probably going to send other federal resources in, and Michigan will not be holding Toledo much longer.
There is like a basically zero chance that the territory of Michigan will be able to fight off the combined forces of a nationalized Ohio National Guard.
Just Ohio, by the way, not mentioning anything else that is going to be brought to bear on them.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Which Andrew Jackson 100% will bring to bear on them.
100%. And here's the thing, like, because we discussed this a little bit as well in the pre-podcast, like the Insurrection Act of 1807, essentially gives the federal government this right to do that.
Right.
So, and I don't think there's going to be anybody with any qualms about this. Like, Michigan's clearly the aggressor. Mm-hmm. They took over the Strip, and
we also talked other laws that came later, like the Posse Comitatus Act, don't apply yet.
No,
the U.S.
not around.
can use federal troops in a law enforcement capacity, and that is what they're going to do.
Mm-hmm. Now, here's where I think it gets really interesting. If Michigan rejected the pact and tries to take Toledo, this leaves the fate of the Upper Peninsula, which was very easily taken care of in our timeline, up in the air. Because now you have Michigan with just the eastern tip of the peninsula and no Toledo Strip, and Andrew Jackson basically bearing down on them to get the Strip back.
Mm-hmm.
So I happen to think, personally, and I think Chris agreed with me on this, that the Upper Peninsula is going to be given to what will end up becoming the Wisconsin Territory.
The entirety of the Upper Peninsula.
The entirety of it.
Even the tip that is currently part of the Michigan Territory.
And the reason is because it's basically let this be a lesson to you.
They found out.
Yeah, they messed around and found out. And so Andrew Jackson will basically say, all right, we are going to make sure that nobody ever tries any of this funny business ever again. So you don't get Toledo and you don't get the Upper Peninsula either. So
that's a 15-minute episode we just did, and nothing else is affected because of that, right?
Nothing else will happen at all. I mean, I think we could go for another, half hour talking about how this changes the cultural, affinities for the Upper Peninsula, how they have a very strong regional identity, being and kind of see themselves as being the neglected part of Michigan.
Okay.
But that's something I think I'll save for a little bit later if we get to it, because if you couldn't already guess, and if you're looking at how long this episode's runtime is, we're not just ending the episode here, are we, Chris?
No, not at all. And as we were talking off podcast, I'll admit I kind of do this. I find like a wrinkle and just blow things up from there. We know this.
Yep.
Most Americans that are familiar with like this period of history, you're kind of taught, okay, there's like kind of the War of 1812, and then there's the Civil War. And the one thing you learn about this period is there is one slave state admitted and there is one free state admitted. It wasn't necessarily written that that's how things happen, but that's how things wound up happening.
It was a gentleman's agreement, essentially.
Mm-hmm. And the funny wrinkle about this is all of this is happening right around 1836, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Michigan votes in the 1836 election
Mhm.
because Andrew Jackson provisionally admits them under the condition that they accept this deal. In our timeline, they do. They get formally introduced as a state in January 1837, but they have 3 electoral votes that end up going to Jackson's Vice President Van Buren. And Ohio votes actually for William Henry Harrison, who is one of the many Whig candidates that were running in this election. In our timeline, Michigan is not a state for 1836.
so specifically, they do not have 2 United States senators, while the state that was admitted to balance them, Arkansas, does have 2 sitting United States senators. Okay, 2 years, maybe there might be an imbalance, but we know Michigan's coming in. But what else happens around 1836 that comes into play here?
And it's a shame that neither of our, or resident Texans of the podcast are here, because I just gave away the answer. We have the Texas War of Independence going on at the same exact time.
And we postulated that because there's an imbalance in the Senate, and by the way, because of the 3/5 compromise, the House is dominated by Southern forces. They might admit Texas as a territory early. Now, the one thing we did say, they're not going to play this game of Texas having the right to split. You are admitted as one state. But Texas being admitted early brings up a lot of important and interesting things. Let's go to the other side, though, and talk about what that's going to do on the other side of the South. So we probably have a delayed Second Seminole War. So the Second Seminole War, Andrew Jackson was involved in the first. This was the second, where basically the United States Army with militiamen from Alabama and other southern states drive further into Florida, kind of take out central Florida, Orlando area, and forcibly resettle. They forcibly resettle the Seminole Nation there, and they also capture. The Seminoles have been very big on harboring fugitive slaves. They're now taken out. They're now taken in as well. Once those two things happen, once we've settled the Michigan militia and the Seminoles in Florida, the United States kind of has a large and experienced military force. What does that lead to? What happens?
Yeah. Well, and also just to backtrack for a quick second back to the Second Seminole War, we had discussed a little bit that if Jackson takes these troops to settle what's going on in the Toledo War, where are they not at the moment? They're not in Florida.
Right.
So ultimately, while we do believe and think that this fork would result in both, the Seminoles and the Toledo conflicts being taken care of, this does push the Second Seminole War's main, I guess, focus, or the main.
I think what we talked about is, with just about all of these wars, they are wars of choice.
Yes.
There are not Seminoles like invading Biloxi, okay?
Right.
They're not. And so because we're busy in Michigan, it just pushes back the timeline of the Second Seminole War.
Yeah, a little bit. And we have, as a result of that, basically 2-time veterans, right? We got in internal American conflicts. We have battle hardened from the Toledo War and now in the Seminole War. These regiments of troops are now primed and ready to involve themselves in what we see as a sooner conflict with Mexico.
So again, geography heavy episode.
Yep.
Because
we do apologize, but it is the
I
nature of
make
the
no
beast.
such apologies. You read a freaking map, people, okay?
Hey, I did the National Geographic GOB as a kid, actually, coincidentally, with this friend who suggested this topic. So there you go, another shout out.
How far
So
you
know what?
go?
I retract my apology as well.
How far you go?
Unfortunately, I did not win the GOB there, but I did. I made it pretty far in one of the out rounds of the local GOB. But
I went to state twice.
oh wow, nice, very cool.
Regardless, maybe I just talking through all of this, I feel like time traveling history. If you could go back in history and bring Google Maps back to this time frame, it could settle a lot.
Yeah. I've thought about that.
The issue we're talking about now was what was the border of Texas and northern Mexico, and this is literally what the nominal cause in our timeline, almost 10 years later.
Yeah, 1848 time frame.
Correct.
In our timeline.
Correct. Was that the United States and Texas claimed that the border was the Rio Grande. Mexico claimed that the border was the Nueces River. You don't have to be a geography person to know which of those rivers it wound up being.
Yep.
The United States sent troops into the area between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. They might have sent troops over the Rio Grande, even in our timeline. Regardless, they were fired upon, and that was the cause used for the Mexican-American War.
They basically goaded them to shoot first.
Yeah, a young Illinois congressman, Abraham Lincoln, during the one term he's elected for in the House, put forward something called a spot resolution because, as I set out, he wasn't even sure which side of the Rio Grande these troops were on when they were fired upon.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Let me be very clear with that. There is still to this day dispute as to whether those troops were in what we consider Mexico today.
Yep.
However, all of that aside, the thing is, in this timeline, because of Michigan, because of the Second Seminole War, the United States has a much bigger and more experienced military. When you call up, this is something we've talked about before, which is the United States normally, kind of like how we put forward this Michigan thing happening. The United States loses the beginning of a lot of wars because we're trying to get ready. And once we are ready, we just smash. In this case, though, we've got militiamen, we've got regulars that have a decent amount of updated experience. So what does that do?
Yeah. So it's very interesting to think through that because when we're thinking of the time frame here, we're positing that this new, I guess we call it the new, Mexican-American War is happening, sometime during the administration of John Tyler, if I recall correctly, in like the early 1840s.
So let's pause and take a step back. Let's bring American politics up to
let's fast forward, because we need to make sure that they're caught
so we
up.
can fast forward.
Rewind so we fast forward. Yeah.
The 1836 election that we talked about was Andrew Jackson actually recognizes a precedent and decides he can't run for more than 2 consecutive terms.
Which is crazy.
Yeah, that might be another fork of ours. That might be something.
You know what? I would love to do that. That'd be really interesting.
However, he kind of he puts up his vice president, his vice president runs, Martin Van Buren of New York, wins in 1836. But almost immediately, there's the economic collapse, the Panic of 1837.
Panic of 37, yep.
That was somewhat caused by land speculation in the West. We could talk about, hey, if there's a lot more West, what is that even going to be worse about?
Mm-hmm.
But bringing it back, 1840 election, political gravity catches up with the Democratic Party.
Yeah, because we have had 3 terms, 12 years of Democrats at this point between Jackson and Van Buren, and with an economy going down the tubes, it's time for
and with all of this other unsettlement that we've been talking about.
Exactly. We have this added on top of it too.
And there's something to be said for, you mentioned previously who won the election of 1840?
Harrison won in 1840, and he famously refused to put on a coat during the longest inaugural address in history and promptly succumbed a month later after he got inaugurated.
But, William Henry Harrison from Ohio.
From the state of Ohio.
A war hero fighting against, I want to say Tecumseh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're correct.
With this kind of unsettlement, plus the political gravity, he wins. But again, he doesn't survive long enough to do anything. So that's why we have President John Tyler making these decisions.
And John Tyler takes the reins, and it wasn't even, he basically established the precedent himself of the vice president ascending to the presidency upon the president's death, because that was not completely clear in the Constitution. And so, although in our timeline, the result of this war is not going to significantly change American electoral politics on a presidential level, it certainly will change things on a congressional level and then have much bigger repercussions, I think, ripple effects in the pond downstream a bit. And we're talking about that now with John Tyler overseeing, a much earlier Mexican-American war.
Mm-hmm. So we think the United States is, if possible, more successful in this.
Yes.
But probably doesn't lead to that much of a different, I'm going to say, geographic settlement in terms of the lands that the United States takes. But we kind of threw one thing at you, which was, if we move this up, what hasn't happened by the time the United States takes over California? Sutter's Mill.
Mm-hmm.
Sutter's Mill, the discovery of gold. Basically, all right, let's talk football.
Completely different direction.
We talked about this at the very beginning about the rivalry between Ohio and Michigan, and what does that bring for football? I don't care. 49ers.
Yep.
49ers are Northern California's team. 1849 is when gold was first discovered at Sutter's Mill in Northern California. Mexican-American War was 48.
48. And so in our timeline, this is what really, accelerated the development of California and made them eventually be admitted
of California.
Admission in 1850. That is the key. In this timeline, with a much sooner Mexican-American War and the discovery of gold not until later, there is no, real push for California to be admitted. This is significant because around this time in our timeline, the whole gentleman's agreement balancing between different states is no longer upheld. And we also had, it brewing in the background, Michigan not admitted until later. And so Arkansas and Texas sticking out as imbalancing.
Arkansas, Texas is a territory.
Texas is still a territory at this point.
But
And of course, Michigan eventually gets into the Union.
But because of what we talked about, in our timeline, the United States, because we just took this and want to make very clear we still own this and all of that, the United States rushes to admit California in the Compromise of 1850 without a balancing southern state. That leads to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which was a salve to the southern interest. You let us admit California is a free state, you can have that. In this timeline, we don't have the immediacy. When you have to do it tomorrow, you're not able to think through and do things as well.
Yeah.
So the United States is trying to pull an all-nighter to admit California, and that's what resulted.
Now here's something, and here's a monkey wrench I'm going to throw in here, Chris, that we actually did not discuss at all.
Try me.
Hey, well, you know what? I don't think I can ever out monkey wrench the professional monkey wrench thrower of the A Fork in Time podcast. I'm definitely not going to here, but this is something that popped into my mind that I do think we should discuss briefly. And that is shifting the result of this, shifting the war, shifting everything up a few years. We did say, we don't really think there's going to be anything that would change our territorial acquisitions. I think there's possibly one that could change. Okay. And that is in 1841, we have the proclamation of I believe it's the Second Republic of the Yucatan. Because in 1823, they had the first one, folded within 7 months. But this time, the second one began in 1841, independence from the Central Republic of Mexico. There was in our timeline in 1848, a bill proposed in the U.S. Senate to admit the Yucatan. And that was never taken up, never happened. But shift the Mexican-American War up a few years and a newly proclaimed Republic of the Yucatan with a sooner Texas, I think there's a very strong possibility that there's a stronger push.
Absolutely not.
Is this because of the Yucatan would be a slave state?
No. It's because the Yucatan has people in it.
People that we don't necessarily want at that point.
To
put it nicely,
that don't fit into how the United States kind of understands things. I
like how we're dancing around it.
I'll say it. These are, by the way, even today, like southern Mexico, especially the Yucatan and other areas, are the most heavily indigenous areas. That's Maya country.
Yep.
And the United States doesn't see any reason to be, I enjoy how at the beginning of this, we got rid of the only non-contiguous U.S. state, and now you want to go and append another peninsula onto something that makes no sense. Now we've got.
I was just trying to think through
time frame.
I was just trying to think through time frames on this, Chris. That's all I'm thinking of.
Sure. Yeah, it's an interesting question, but the idea that we voluntarily take that on, and the other part of it is it being non-contiguous, it also not really lending itself to the kind of agriculture the United States is used to.
Yeah, trying to govern something across from, the Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America, however you want to call it in modern nomenclature. And it's not as, economically viable or important. Yeah, I can definitely see the argument there for sure.
So getting back, so we have we're looking at, call it 1844. Probably the Mexican-American War is going on, but is closing up, I think. Does this change anything?
I'm trying to think. I'm also trying to think through if this changes anything. I don't think this really changes anything in terms of John Tyler's fate.
Okay.
Because in terms of what happened to him, he became, the president without a party, essentially. Um, there was no real support from him either side of the political aisle. So I think that even with a successful, Mexican-American war, I think that the two sides are still going to, not want really anything to do with him. I personally feel, just because he's kind of, in my view, kind of a uniquely unfortunate, in some sense, caustic figure, I guess you could say, politically. Like, he didn't really do himself any favors.
Sure.
But what I do think is interesting is we could see how this changes the issues in the 1844 election. Because in 1844, we have someone who is very manifest destiny, James K. Polk, which, by the way, Tyler was basically manifest destiny light. He was destiny light before Polk came in. Now, with regards to the issues in the 1844 election, I think this would, there's a couple of ways that one can think about this. Because in our timeline, we did not have the Mexican-American War yet, and there was a lot of, fervor and building support for manifest destiny. You could argue that led to Polk, getting to the White House. In this timeline, we already have a lot of that pressure valve being released. And as we said also as well, California is not really going to be something at the forefront of our minds of, we got to pull an all-nighter to get these guys into our fold.
Right.
They're a territory of ours still, but there's no motivation at that point. So does Henry Clay finally have his time to shine? Like, Polk is a dark horse candidate.
Yeah.
He rose through the ranks basically almost entirely because of his manifest destiny pitch. Do the Democrats take a different take? Do the Democrats take a different take that ultimately, may or may not stick as well?
And by the way, I think Henry Clay might be a really good choice for this one because of the compromises that he brings forward.
I think this is what I was thinking about as well. Just literally right as you said that, my brain was like, the great compromiser. This is possibly where this might be going.
Now, the one I like that. I think this is Henry Clay's time.
I think it is.
The one thing we danced a little bit around was this. I kind of firmed up. We still have, in this point, Texas as a territory, Florida as a territory. Both of those change at this time in our timeline. I think basically that Henry Clay, brings about, one, a compromise to admit an expanded Wisconsin. That includes the Upper Peninsula. At this point, Iowa was also admitted. Like, in our timeline, you had Florida, Texas, Iowa, Wisconsin, all admitted about the same time. I think that happens around
within a few years, in the 1840s. Yeah.
The one thing is, you mentioned earlier about how John Tyler became president.
Yep.
The one thing, shout out to Bo Breslin. We kind of don't realize, the United States sometimes doesn't realize things might become an issue until they just became an issue, and then we'll come up with a fix.
Yep.
And I think what we talked about earlier with the Arkansas advantage, the Arkansas slipping in because Michigan plays around and hasn't been seeded yet, that there is a temporary imbalance. What I think might be what the grand bargain of the Great Compromise: Florida, Texas, Iowa, Wisconsin, but some kind of codification that from now on we will admit states in pairs and the other state doesn't get seated until the balancing state has actually been seated as well. So something saying two states will come in together.
Mhm.
I think that I think at this point that might be what the United States comes up with. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I was kind of thinking through some of those possibilities, but
Mhm.
admittedly, also when you were talking there, I was more focused on trying to figure out the direction the Democrats would take in the 44 election, looking at how that convention went down. And I think that it's really interesting because now that we've changed some of the chess pieces,
Mhm.
with regards to Texas annexation, like that was a big issue, in our timeline in this election. Martin Van Buren, he has an interesting post-presidential career. In our timeline. And he kind of tries to run for president a couple times after he's out of office.
Mhm.
He becomes a free soiler, runs as a third party, in our timeline later on. What I'm thinking through is, so we have Clay, who stays as as like the Whig candidate. And because of all of these other outstanding issues and the Manifest Destiny groundswell, with Polk becoming that compromise candidate, he initially showed up to the convention hoping to become vice president. And then because between the backers of like Van Buren and Calhoun were very much at loggerheads, opposed to each other. We also have like Lewis Cass in the mix as well, some other candidates. But really, from what I'm understanding, the main like kind of conflict within the Democrats at this point is between someone who has, very pronounced views on the admission of Texas
Mhm.
and Calhoun, who is a full-on states' rights, slavery, candidate.
Mhm.
Okay. And Polk becomes you know, the compromise. I think with Clay, staying as the big compromise candidate, trying to play along to get along, make everybody be happy, but we already have the balance not working out,
It temporarily. It didn't work out
temporarily.
and we know that could happen. But Michigan has now been admitted, so we are balanced
But
right
we're
now.
good. We're good now. But do you think that this could possibly lead to a sort of, I don't know. I'm again, because this is just something I'm kind of
Yeah.
like spitballing right now. So maybe you can better articulate it. But what I'm thinking is if we have a choice between a full compromise candidate and somebody who recognizes that the deals that are coming down, the possible deals coming down the pipeline are, and this is something we discussed in the pre-podcast, the possible deals are likely not going to help the South if they are accepted.
Okay.
And this is something that we're operating off of the pre-podcast knowledge, so we'll have to probably backfill. This happens a lot in this episode. Rewind so we can fast forward. But I think if we have a trend where the South is starting to realize that the compromises are not going to necessarily shake in their favor, I don't think it's going to shift as much as being as extreme as nominating Calhoun or someone like him. But maybe the 1844 Democrats, and this is part of why they end up losing to the compromise candidate, is because they do nominate someone who is a little bit more of that strain, of that ilk. Maybe somebody like who I confuse my 1840s presidents sometimes between Fillmore and Buchanan, but I believe Buchanan was the one who's from Pennsylvania who has who has that kind of Southern sympathizing streak in him.
He's the president that kind of lets the Civil War start and sits back and does nothing.
That lets it all happen. So, like, I guess, maybe someone like a Buchanan or I don't know what Buchanan is doing at this point.
I think we're too early for Buchanan.
I think it's a little too early for him.
Yeah.
I mean, because he's in our timeline, he's Secretary of State in 45, and he's just a senator from Pennsylvania up until this point. So, yeah, a little bit too early in his career. But
so Henry Clay is the nominee of the Whigs. Who are you proposing as the Democrat?
I
Better
think I
yet,
have.
rather than attaching a name, describe the Whig, I guess is a better way to
Well,
ask.
actually, I do think I have a potential name. I
Okay.
do have a potential name from someone who has a has skin in the game.
Mhm.
You know, when all this whole Michigan and Ohio stuff is happening, he is a candidate that is in the running in our timeline, and he is in
Okay.
fact from Michigan,
Okay.
and that is Lewis Cass.
Okay.
I think he stands a pretty decent chance
So
in this
first,
alternate timeline.
who is Lewis Cass? What is his side in the Michigan dispute, and what wing of the Democratic Party is he nominated from? Kind of where is he within that continuum?
Yeah. So, and I'm kind of flying by the seat of my pants here because, I'm just doing some quick, Googling and looking
Mhm.
around and trying to put some pieces together. But
Why are you admitting it? We all do it, but you don't need to say
honestly, hey, we all do this during the show, but we don't have to make it as as explicit. But my understanding
Uh-huh.
is he was kind of trying to be, in the 1844 convention, he was kind of trying to. So he first of all, he's a former Secretary of War. He, was a U.S. minister to France. So he, as far as I'm aware, he's kind of a, you know, more steady as she goes, more of what you can call, if there is an establishment, quote unquote, at the time. And Van Buren, of course, in this timeline, he was the presumptive nominee going into 1844. But I think Cass, if I understand him correctly, is he was more of the Van Buren side of the Democratic Party,
Okay.
but he wasn't someone that the Southern Democrats could really side with either,
Okay.
if that makes sense. That's just my very loose understanding of who he is. I'm sure we have people like astute historians in going down to the comment section right now telling me how wrong I am.
See, the one thing I think is just given like how bad a name Michigan is going to get out of this,
Mm-hmm.
it kind of puts the kibosh on like any Wolverine president for a while.
For a long
It
time.
might be brought up for Gerald Ford. Like
That
when
is
you
very
step out of
true.
line that bad.
That is true. So
But
maybe it's not him,
yeah.
but I guess what I'm trying to say is I feel like, and there might not even be a name to throw out necessarily. I mean,
Yeah.
I could look into Van Buren's, vice president.
I like Calhoun for it.
You think they're going to swing all the way to the Calhoun contingency?
Because by the way, Calhoun as like a Southern expansionist has been pretty successful.
That is true. That is very true.
That has won them votes. And if you look at the argument for the internal Democratic Party, like when we got away from the core of the like not the new states,
Mm-hmm.
because when we went back to kind of the old traditional colonial states, we got creamed.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an argument to be made of keeping the Democratic Party kind of the party of the South and the West. And by the way, there is a lot more of the South and the West here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I think you have an election of 1844 fought on expansion versus consolidation, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think I like what you said. We actually finally have a Henry Clay
Yes.
presidency on this.
I think so.
Basis.
Well, but I don't think the nominee really changes either way because the more I looked into Cass, he was basically a popular sovereignty guy.
Mhm.
So I think either way you look at it, like whether you have someone who's proposing, popular sovereignty versus someone who's proposing like basically just naked, brazen, expansion of slavery, I think Clay would definitely appeal to an electorate.
Because by the
that
way, let's just say this. Kind of what you were talking about earlier with everything coming down the pipe scares the Southern forces. Popular sovereignty probably scares them.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Which
so you
is
don't
interesting.
want your nominee advocating popular sovereignty.
Indeed, yeah, because and it's interesting because in our timeline, I tend to think of popular sovereignty as something that was much more of a Southern position.
Mm-hmm.
But in this timeline, especially at this point, I think that's something they're not going to necessarily want to go for.
Right.
So, yeah. Okay, so we have a President Clay in 1844 as a result of a little strip of land being fought over between Michigan and Ohio.
Yeah. The other thing is,
I like where we ended up with this.
And I think what Clay does is he comes in and he, does the grand bargain we talked about, the 4-state admission, and he probably has some kind of codification about the deal, about,
the gentleman's agreement becomes codified.
Right, because like I said earlier, it's actually caused an issue with it not being codified. That happens. And I think the interesting thing is this. Right now it is, the mid 1840s.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to jump to 48? Because I think we get Polk in 48. Because Polk initially won.
I actually think that's
because Polk initially won based on trying to settle the Canadian border, which we have not talked about.
Which we have not even discussed at all. Isn't a whole nother can of worms.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but like in our timeline, it was, the Oregon border.
Right.
Right. And I think, and also in our timeline.
Well, you say the Oregon border, but basically the border of Montana, Idaho, and Washington.
Yeah. What was known as the Oregon Territory, all of that area. And Polk won because he linked that also to the Texas issue, which is not something that we're even discussing.
Right.
In this timeline. So, so I think Polk in 1848 makes a lot of sense because essentially Clay is going to be coming in, working his wizardry, working his compromise magic. But I feel with the pressures of the still, relatively young nation at this point, the can of magical compromise pixie dust is probably going to start running a little dry at some point.
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
and California is still a outstanding issue, and Polk is going to come in and say, okay, not only do we got to clean up Oregon, but we got to clean up California as a state too, because now in 1849, which is after the election, but California is still a territory. Polk is going to be able to come in and say, hey, we got a big set of territories outstanding that are all more likely than not going to be free states to a certain degree.
Yeah.
And I think he can ride that to the presidency in 48. Now, this is something
the one thing he's delivered on is a codification of the deal.
Yes. Clay doing the codification of the deal.
Clay did it, but we can say, hey, listen, we need to support that. We need to keep that in.
We're going to do it better than him.
We, the Democrats, forced that into the...
Yes, I think that you can make a very convincing argument of that. Mm-hmm. And this is something I also just threw out as a possibility in the pre-podcast. And this is something that we discussed in the American Monarchy arc. And I'll just throw out here briefly as well. Do we get a split California in this timeline as part of maintaining the bargain? I think that's a very strong possibility.
There's a couple of very important things happening right about now. And the first of those is, yes, I think you do have a split California. I think you wind up with that because Southern California is kind of what Polk thinks is rich, for the lack of a better phrase.
Yeah.
I think the two more very important things that need to be talked about. One is 1848 in Europe, basically chasing out tons of middle-class German farmers that flood into the new states in our
timeline. Yep.
And they flood into the states of Minnesota and Wisconsin and now the UP and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is you're right now dealing with the Irish potato famine. And I think these two things are what tips the balance. Because once you have those population shifts to the northern states, that is when you have the South becoming electorally vulnerable.
At a pretty big disadvantage.
Because, the election of 1860, the census of 1850 apportions population.
Yeah.
The election of 1860 hasn't had that happen yet, but basically those populations have shifted enough for the first time. You can have a president elected with no support in the South, which you haven't been able to before.
Which up until this point, you have had to have at least had some sort of concession or some sort of bone thrown to the South. And this is something, I think that's something that's really potentially fascinating to go through. I'll loop this back to the UP as well, because I did say we might be able to talk about how the UP is different from this. In our timeline, they have an incredibly strong regional identity. They have, I think, 3% of their population of the state of Michigan, but 29% of the land area. So it's very sparsely populated, and it has, kind of this almost I would say a superiority complex, culture-wise. They're like
inferiority.
Reverse that. Inferiority complex versus the Lower Peninsula. And they feel very disadvantaged. They feel very, forgotten. It's kind of like how Staten Island is thought of as the forgotten borough of New York City. They think of it
should be.
Hey, we're going for the whole triple crown of which regions we can offend with this.
And don't get me started on Westchester.
Absolutely. Anyway, so if we have, and the UP in our timeline, if I remember correctly, is mainly akin to Minnesota's ethnic makeup. In other words, mostly Scandinavian, if I'm remembering correctly.
Minnesota and Wisconsin. Both.
Minnesota and Wisconsin. In our timeline, they are connected, geographically, again, back to geography, they're connected to Wisconsin.
And economically, a lot of their... Yep.
And so here's the thing. I think the, culturally, economically, politically, being a part of Wisconsin, changes the regional identity and changes, how the UP thinks of themselves completely.
Yes.
But it also, as you said, if we have German immigrants coming in to the Wisconsin territory, hey, the UP is part of that too.
Right.
And we can have the Germans basically kind of be reminded of the Black Forest, as they come into the UP. So that's a really interesting, you have a different flavor of European, essentially, coming in, settling, and then going to be able to reap the economic benefits of, the iron mines later on in the timeline. Because I forget exactly when that starts becoming a bigger deal in the UP, but I digress.
It's getting there at this point, because the timber, all of it, and the economic shipping along the Great Lakes are all critical. And one of the reasons this area booms and actually attracts all of these new immigrants.
Yep.
So here's so we do have a split California. The
We will
big
have to
question
we
is,
will have to find an off ramp at this point because
yeah.
well, we'll talk about Split California, but like, yeah, there's a lot of different interesting ways, little but big ways that we reoriented things here.
So the question I have is this: if we have a California split, California might be the last. I think California might be the last state. The Californias
The Californias, yeah.
might be the last states admitted because
But are you saying before the Civil War?
before the Civil War,
I would tend to agree, actually.
because if you've got it in writing that you cannot, you have to have a balance. Kansas, Nebraska cannot happen.
Kansas, Nebraska does not happen.
All of these other things. What do you wind up admitting as a southern state?
Yeah, I mean, there basically is Yucatan throws a Hail Mary. Just throw that in there. But no, like the South basically doesn't have much of anything left after Southern California.
Right.
So, and this is where I think a lot of this episode was kind of leading to at the end. And we had to take a little bit of, rewinding to fast forward to get there. But I think if you accelerate the Mexican-American War, you accelerate some of these trends, just kind of from the outset, it would therefore make sense for the Civil War to also be moved up a little bit
accelerated,
as well. Accelerated, yeah. So, and that's really interesting because, if we were, I'm not saying we will, but if we were to revisit this for a potential part two, that would be interesting to see the impacts of a sooner Civil War, let's call it 1856.
Probably 50s. Yeah. 50s.
Yeah, 1854, 55, 56. That would be really, that would be a really interesting fork. Continued fork, I would say, to go down.
Yeah. I think that's interesting. I mean, the other part of it is you have moved that up. You've moved up some of it.
Yeah, because Minnesota's not in, Oregon's not in, Kansas isn't in.
By the way, the one thing I will say is, if you look at, and by the way, just to share this with everyone else, we are not good enough to know off the top of our heads when all of these states were admitted. We definitely looked up when states are admitted.
We got the Encyclopedia Britannica page. Yep.
That being said, if you look further on down, as soon as the government of the United States is no longer having to pay attention to the South, West Virginia, Kansas, technically, Nevada, there's a flood of states that get admitted. So I think we're there's
an 8-year break between California and Minnesota. In our timeline. So
because we have the codified deal, you have Minnesota, Oregon, Kansas, all of these states being held in territorial status, trying to come up with something to admit them. As soon as the South gets cute,
I think, just
all
boom,
of them are
boom, boom. Yep,
admitted.
All of them get through the gates. Yeah. I think that's as good a place as any to wrap things up here, Chris.
I am gonna throw one more thing out.
Yeah, go right ahead.
There. If we do want to revisit this, we talked about the one boat in our Mexican-American War, where, kind of like the there's a musical play, I think, about like one night. I wish Dylan was on for this because it was in Memphis, where like Johnny Cash, Elvis, they were all together. We did an episode on the one boat where it's like Grant.
Yeah, it was like Lee, Grant and Lee and all these important people ends up sinking. Yeah.
If we move up the Mexican-American War, do we change their experiences where they're not the future commanders?
Yeah, I think that's a very strong possibility. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think maybe and I'm just speaking, completely not knowing, like, whether or not Grant or Lee or those people had combat experience in the like in I think it was too soon for them to have combat experience in like the Seminole Wars or whatever.
Lee had some because he was around early enough.
Okay. But yeah, shifting that up a little bit means that we'll have different players who would be in both the Toledo War and the Seminole War and the Sooner Mexican American War. So that would be interesting, trying to figure out where all of those X's and O's on the chart and the chess pieces are moving around.
So, we welcome comments on this.
Yeah.
I don't know. By the way, big question to all listeners. I want to know what you guys think. What do you guys think about multiple episodes? Because we've talked amongst ourselves and realized that just about every single episode we wind up doing turns into a multi-parter. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think I would love, if you have listened up until this point, I would love to hear feedback on that, because I will say, from the perspective of the, co-host podcaster, I really enjoy multi-parters because it allows us the opportunity to be able to fully, dissect and continue an interesting fork later down the road and see where the ripple effects take us. But I also do understand that from like a media consumption perspective, there is a tendency, unless like a sequel or second part is like something absolutely amazing, just kind of the rule of attrition is you kind of lose, some followers or some listeners over time, because you have to listen to multiple parts in order to be able to understand what's going on. So for as niche a podcast community as what we have here, I would be interested in hearing what you guys think. I happen to think that most anybody who's still very tuned in at this point are probably our most hardcore fans, who are going to be like, yeah, we listen to whatever you guys put out, so go for what you want. But we open any kind of feedback, critical, praising, the whole multi-part idea, or just some other perspectives or thoughts on that. Yeah, we'd love to hear what you guys have to think.
Yeah. Again, Evan is great about posting on the Discord, finding the episodes whenever. That is a great place. Wherever you find us, comment. But yeah, and just to close everything out, if you should come across a fork in the road, what do we suggest?
I think you should take it.
All right. See you guys next week.
See you later.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.